huge changes in media power worldwide. Many of these are links to the troubled times we're living in. Every morning I wake up and listen to lots of different news services from around the world. It's part of my job. And I slightly get motion sickness because global politics are shifting and tilting like we've never had before. Most of us in this room come from hard-won democracies. We decided to hold our conference here in Jamaica because, as Chris Barnes said next door, Jamaica ranks so highly, number 5, on the World Media Freedom Index. It's a real honor to hold that position in a world where media freedom is constantly being eroded by populism, by authoritarian media systems, and by threats to media freedom, and the word that I agree with our president, Paul Thompson, we shouldn't say the FN word that undermines the values of news that we deliver. But I'm now going to steal some words from a far better orator than I. Former President Barack Obama gave a Mandela address in South Africa just a few weeks ago. Democracy depends on strong institutions, and it's about minority rights and checks and balances, and freedom of speech, and freedom of expression, and a free press, and the right to protest and petition the government, and an independent judiciary, and everybody having to follow the law. And yes, democracy can be messy, it can be slow, and it can be frustrating. I know, I promise. But the efficiency that's offered by an autocrat, that's a false promise. Don't take that one, because it leads invariably to more consolidation of wealth at the top, power at the top, and it makes it easier to conceal corruption and abuse. For all its imperfections, real democracy best upholds the idea that government exists to serve the individual and not the other way round. And it is the only form of government that has the possibility of making that idea real. I was really amazed when I heard those words, maybe not surprised, because that's what underpins what we all do. What kind of media actually works with those words? Well, one kind of media, one media system I know of that's about far more than entertainment. It's the sort of media that puts the public interests center stage. It's the kind of media that people turn to in their droves when there's a crisis, when there's an emergency, when there's a disaster, when they need to come together around some triumph, when they need to know what to do, where to go, when they need information that they can trust. It's the media that puts those values of free speech, independence, transparency, open access at its core. It's a media that underpins democracy. And that kind of media is public media. It comes in many shapes and sizes. Something like 150 media organizations worldwide define themselves as public media. Many are public broadcasters, national media organizations, well-established brands with broadcasting at their core, but now sharing their journalism, their values, via new digital platforms. All factors that build credibility with the people who fund them. And these public media organizations are run by people like you. That's why we've come together to meet here in Kingston today, to explore our shared values, to understand better what it is that we do day in, day out, when the world is marketing new media. But public broadcasting still sounds, well, a bit crusty. It's like having that favourite auntie. The public grumble, you complain about your aunt, she's a bit out of fashion, but when there's a crisis, you know right whose kitchen you want to be in to get the best information. And it's the same with public media. Like all media everywhere, public media is evolving. It is new. The leaders in the field are some of the strongest tech players on new platforms in the world. And many of the smallest are the greatest innovators. Today is a media conference, but it's a different sort of conference, because we also hope and aim that it's going to be a conversation. Wherever you've travelled from today, we need, as public media, to gather our thoughts and share our experiences, because to move forward, we need to sell public media. We need to have a clear idea of what it is in the modern world and just how special it is. So thank you again for your long journeys. I'd like to briefly introduce the Public Media Alliance team. There's only 5 of us, and we've left Mervyn, our finance manager, at home. He's busy counting paper clips and sending us emails saying we can't afford to do this, that, and the other. But he's a very important member of the team. And then if my colleagues would just stand at the back of the room, Jazz Chandler, who I think most of you know, our projects and membership manager. Christian Porter, who's our editorial manager. And Marta Catalano, who's our new content and digital content and communications manager. That team, I hesitate and I stumble a little bit with their titles because, frankly, we do everything. So Christian designed this portable screen. That comes with us. Jazz and I lugged it through the airport. It comes in a wheelie bin. We take it around the world. Everything we do ourselves. We're a bit like public media. You fund us, so we guard every penny, every cent you give us very, very jealously, and we're very aware that it's you that keep our work going. We have a hashtag today, hashtag PM18, for those of you on Twitter, and we hope that there will be a good social media conversation around today's events. Our friends at PCBJ are actually recording today's events. Now, if any of you who are speaking, or if you wish not to be recorded, then just please indicate that to any member of the team, and we'll make sure that the cameras stop, and we will also be having a look at the tapes afterwards before any broadcast or reuse of the material. I have no doubt that the person who clocked up the most air miles to be with us in Kingston is the recently re-elected president of PMA, Paul Thompson, editor-in-chief and CEO of Radio New Zealand. Paul hasn't only upped his air miles on this trip, he's also seen Jamaica, because out of all of our delegates, only one managed to realise that Jamaica is quite a big place, and he actually went to the wrong end. And it was only when we checked with the taxi company, who thought they were picking him up at Norman Manley Airport, that we realised Paul was going to have his own little party down in Mo Bay. With the help of our colleagues in the CBU and Sonia, we staged a rescue mission and we got him out, and we've now got to get him back later in the week. But can I welcome Paul Thompson?
Well, it's great to be here. It took me a little while, but fantastic experience being here as part of the PMA team, meeting our colleagues from the CBU, and really looking forward to today. And we should probably just note Sally Ann. She mentioned her team, but Sally Ann is the driver of the PMA, and we should just thank her for all she's done to create this conference. So well done. And I think just so positive to hear Sally Ann's endorsement of the role of public media, what we do and why we do it, and why we are different. We look forward to celebrating that today. It's my privilege to get the proceedings underway by introducing our first speaker, Julie Drizin. Julie is the Executive Director of Current. And I think most of you would have seen Current, which is the independent voice of public media in the US, an excellent publication, and one that focuses intently and independently on covering the industry in the United States and more widely. Julie is an editor, a trainer, a strategist, a producer, a teacher, an academic, and an advocate for public media. She's been described as an experienced, passionate, skilled public media leader and innovator. I'm really looking forward to hearing her talk. She's going to talk for 15 or 20 minutes. I think she will be challenging us, making us think, and explaining the importance of championing public media in these really interesting and testing times. Once she's finished her formal remarks, we'll open it up for questions and to continue the conversation that Sally Ann mentioned. So please give a warm welcome to Julie.
Good morning. Happy to entertain. I want to thank Sally Ann for inviting me to this assembly. I have to confess that before she contacted me, I had never heard of the Public Media Alliance before. And you might wonder, how's that possible for someone who's worked in public media in the US for 35 years? How could I be completely unaware of this international coalition? Well, the answer, of course, is that I'm an American. What do we know? We're raised to pay little, if no, attention to what's happening outside our borders, outside our narrow field of vision. We're too busy eating and tweeting and burning every last fossil fuel we can find. Now, I'm not here to trash talk my fellow Americans, even as they make it extremely difficult these days. I am here to share some thoughts about the future of public media. Now, you're probably wondering, what the heck is that woman wearing, right? I'm wearing a story. Actually, it's a lot of stories, but I doubt anyone will get close enough to actually read them. Does anybody here still read newspapers on a daily basis? Yeah, okay, good. Let me tell you the story behind my newspaper dress. In 2015, I became the executive director of Current, which, as Paul mentioned, is the trade publication that serves public media in the United States. And when I started there, Current was still publishing 23 print editions per year. And too many of those editions were losing money. Subscription revenues were plummeting. Why? Because all of our content was available online for free. You've heard this story before. And that honeymoon had to come to an end. We began to cut back on print, and 1 year ago, we finally introduced a paywall. The new digital subscription was a big transition for Current and for our readers. Now, back to the dress. To make a short story long, public broadcasting in the US employs over 20,000 people, anywhere from, and there are at least a dozen conferences each year that bring those people together. 20, 40, 200, 1,200 people attend these events, whether they're engineers or TV programs, journalists, news directors, independent producers, fundraisers. We are a nation of many associations. So last year when we introduced our digital subscription, I asked the organizer of one of the largest conventions if I could have just a few minutes on the stage to let everybody know about our new digital subscription program and how important it was to our survival and our ability to serve the industry. The answer was no. Why? Because Current wasn't a sponsor of the conference, and you basically have to pay to play in order to get stage time, even at a public media gathering. But not here at the Public Media Alliance conference, I'm happy to say. So I needed to come up with a way to draw attention to Current. So I made this dress. Actually, I had it made. I didn't make it myself, everybody asks. And I wore it. And see, newsprint is still good for something. The stunt sparked a lot of conversations about the future of Current, and I even came up with a very corny punchline, which I've used again and again, and I'll use it here today, that I am Current's new business model. Enough about the dress. Let's turn from the shallow to the deep here. What is public media's mission in these times? In the United States, public media is funded by the people. The federal government appropriates about $450 million each year to public broadcasting. That's about $1.20 per person. You can't even get half of a cup of coffee for that. And that amount of money has not budged in more than a decade. And every year, without fail, conservative legislators use public broadcasting as a political football and try to eliminate our funding. They say we're too liberal, that government has no business in broadcasting, and that in an era of so much content, we're no longer necessary, that we should work everything out on our own. But I would say that we are needed now more than ever. Most of the support for public media in the US doesn't come from the government. It comes directly from listeners and viewers who donate to their favorite public radio and television stations. And it comes from businesses that want to be mentioned on the air as sponsors, and from a small group of foundations. Right now, it's a $3.5 billion industry. It might sound like a lot of money, but it's not for a sector that offers free, universal, and excellent service to all Americans. Public media obviously can't compete with the new masters of the universe, the Amazons and Netflix, the Apples and Facebooks, but when it comes to the essential service we provide, there's simply no comparison. Important institutions like the New York Times and the Washington Post, Disney and Discovery produce urgent and excellent journalism or popular and creative entertainment, and I wouldn't want to see them go away. But their mission is not the same as ours. We are not about delivering profits to owners and executives and shareholders. Public media is guided by a higher calling, a mission to inform and empower people to shape their own destinies, to improve their communities, and thereby have a positive impact on the future of their nation. Now, that mission was articulated 50 years ago by President Lyndon Johnson when he signed the law that created the public broadcasting system in the US. There had been non-commercial educational stations operating before the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, but mostly they were universities of the air, college-based broadcasters that wanted to extend access to education beyond their campus. The Public Broadcasting Act specifically encouraged the use of media for instructional, educational, and cultural purposes. The Act also acknowledged that the diversity of programming depends on freedom, imagination, and initiative on both local and national levels. It said that it's in the public interest to encourage the development of programming that involves creative risk and that addresses the needs of unserved and underserved audiences, particularly children and minorities. It called on public broadcasting to address national concerns and solve local problems through community programs and outreach with maximum protection from extraneous interference and control. This is all directly out of the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. It was a bold vision. Now, I don't know how public media operates in your countries, but in mine, we are in constant struggle between our dependence and our independence. The right considers us too left, the left considers us too right, but we are free to broadcast voices that are critical of government actions and inactions, and to hold our elected and appointed leaders accountable. And I hope that that's the same for you. And while we accept corporate sponsorship and mention support from those businesses over the air and online, we are relatively free of commercialism. Non-commercialism itself is a value worth protecting. Even as public media in the US must master the metrics and monetize its services with underwriting and on-air solicitations, the bottom line for us is that our listeners and viewers represent more than numbers and dollars and consumers. They are people who turn to us to be informed, enlightened, comforted, connected, challenged, and inspired. In contrast to the majority of the media in my country, public media strives to elicit the best in the human spirit, to build bridges of understanding between people, to help us become better parents, teachers, neighbors, citizens, and stewards of the planet. In a culture that's overrun with messages that tell us we are what we own, that acquisition equals status and happiness, public media is not only refreshing, it's downright revolutionary. Public TV is a safe and commercial-free space for children in a media landscape filled with product placement, harsh language, adult sexuality, and violence in its fiction and nonfiction programming. Parents know that when their preschoolers and elementary students watch PBS, they'll see age-appropriate programs that are educational and entertaining, shows that stimulate curiosity and cultivate civic values. They teach kids that it's good to be kind and helpful, to share and be fair, to ask questions, to work for justice, to take care of people, plants, animals, and the planet. I think that some adults in my country, including some in the White House, could learn so much by watching PBS Kids TV instead of Fox News. Public television also makes sure that the worlds of theater, music, dance, and art remain available and free to all Americans. Public radio opens our ears to an amazing diversity of music that would never be played on commercial radio these days. And when it comes to serious and balanced news and public affairs programming, public media is where it's at. I titled my talk today, "The Fierce Urgency of Now," public media's mission for truth, conversation, and community in troubled times. The fierce urgency of now, it's a phrase that was used by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He said, "We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action." He was talking about both civil rights and the Vietnam War. In my country, we now have a leader who poses a serious threat to both civil rights and to world peace, and frankly, to the fate of the planet itself. His policies threaten public education, public health, public safety. In fact, everything with the word public in front of it is vulnerable. Public transportation, public libraries, public lands, the public square, and public media. And public media must stand up to this threat. We must show and tell the truth. We must reveal corruption and incompetence. And we must give voice to all who hurt. African American parents whose children are racially profiled by our police forces. Latino children who've been traumatically separated from their parents at America's borders. The forgotten veterans of our many wars, families who've lost loved ones to opioid addiction, factory workers who've lost jobs to the global economy, and coal miners displaced by the imperatives of alternative energy sources. The fierce urgency of now. Now, the question of whether or not to call the president's repeated fabrication lies has been debated in public media. Editors at NPR have staked out a position that the word lie is inflammatory because you can't know whether there's an intent to mislead. And the host of PBS NewsHour, our nightly news program on public TV, has said that her show is more comfortable saying that a Trump statement cannot be borne out by the facts. Watching my colleagues, people that I respect, treat our president with undue respect when he is so very disrespectful to everyone except dictators and oppressive regimes, well, that's a really bitter pill for me and for many public media devotees to swallow. What is inflammatory? The president has called the press the enemy of the people, not just once, but frequently, repeatedly. This war of words he's waging on the press poses a real danger to democracy and to the lives of journalists themselves. I live in a country with more than 300 million guns and more than our fair share of untreated mental illnesses. This is dangerous. These are dark times in my nation. The Washington Post has adopted the slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." And by the end of July, their fact tracker had documented 4,229 false or misleading claims made by President Trump over 558 days. That's about 7 or 8 lies a day. Maybe he's trying to get into the Guinness Book of World Records. It is painful to live in a country with increasing signs of fascism and rhetoric that sows division and mistrust. Perhaps some of you have lived through something similar. Perhaps you have some sage advice for us. Now, to be fair, part of the reason why public media in the US won't use the word lie is not because we're dependent on federal government support and afraid that we'll lose it. It's because we need to protect our reputation as a haven for civil discourse. Civility has been on the decline in our society and our media. Shouting has replaced conversation, and listening is very last century. But public media is the one place where people with diverse perspectives and experiences are brought together and are encouraged to listen, to engage in the kind of dialogue that democracy demands. And that is really nothing short of a peacekeeping mission in a volatile and violent world. It's why surveys routinely show that public broadcasting in the US ranks among the most trusted institutions in America. PBS and NPR are seen as more fair than other media outlets. But this trust is very fragile. It must be earned over and over and over again, and we cannot take our audiences or their trust for granted. The demographics of the United States are shifting dramatically. The majority of babies born in America today are brown. Non-white children are already the majority of public school students. Public media is behind the curve on inclusion and diversity. In some cases, we do worse than mainstream commercial media when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Our stations and our networks and our audiences are still overwhelmingly white and college educated, reinforcing a perception that our service is for elites, not for the underserved and minority populations described 50 years ago in the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. Americans no longer trust a media that doesn't look and sound like themselves. Public radio and TV in the US need to work fast to include people of color in highly visible ways, on the air, in our coverage, in editorial decision-making roles, and our leadership. Now, having worked in several newsrooms, I can tell you the truth. It's usually the African American and Latino, Asian, Muslim, Native American reporters who suggest the topics and pitch the story ideas that are relevant to their communities, who actively tap non-white experts in their reporting and treat people as experts on their own lives, while white reporters and interviewers too often look to policymakers, professors, and people with power as having the most expertise. The fierce urgency of now. Inclusion is increasingly important now as newspapers are folding left and right. I recently read that there are half as many journalists working in the newspaper business in the US as there were just a decade ago. This is not good for democracy, especially on the local level, where the newspaper has always been usually the only watchdog against political corruption, industrial pollution, police and judicial misconduct, and many other ills. Public service media in the US is actively trying to fill the void in these so-called news deserts. hundreds of digital-only nonprofit news organizations have sprung up, created by refugees from the newspaper business. Public radio stations in the US are bulking up their newsrooms. They're collaborating with each other and with other media outlets on regional coverage. And both public radio and TV are expanding the ways in which they engage with their local communities in order to be relevant and build trust. We are going back to our roots and our mission to be bold, to take risks, and to try to solve problems. Current, my publication sponsors a contest called Local That Works. I left some postcards about it on your tables. The deadline's already passed. It is our effort to surface and spotlight the things that public media is doing to strengthen their bonds with their local communities through content and engagement initiatives. While the stations have historically relied on strong national content from NPR and PBS to draw in the audiences, that content's now available anytime and anywhere, and as we know, people will increasingly access it in their own time and on their own terms. So local stations need to develop their own unique identities while fulfilling the essential public media mission. Let me tell you briefly about some of the projects that we've highlighted. In Sioux City, Iowa, a small public radio station sponsored live storytelling events that enabled immigrants, many of whom work in the meatpacking industry, to tell their stories of how they came to settle in that town and what they left back home. In Seattle, Washington, a public radio station has sponsored events called Ask a Muslim, Ask a Transgender Person, Ask a Police Officer. These events bring people together who might never meet one another and engage in one-on-one conversations. And by doing so, they make a personal human connection. They listen and learn from one another. And a lot of their stereotypes are challenged. One of the more popular platforms being used in public media in the US is something called Hearken. It's a website widget that asks listeners and viewers, what do you want to know about your city that our reporters can find out for you? These questions are then put to a public vote, and then they become assignments for the reporters. And sometimes the person who asked the question is involved and included in the reporting process itself. These kinds of engagement initiatives and hundreds more that Current is documenting through its Local That Works project, these initiatives are helping public media be more local and be more inclusive. And ultimately, it will help us be more sustainable. It's helping us build trust, and it's helping us raise funds from our readers and listeners and viewers in this rapidly shifting media and economic landscape. Earlier this summer, I traveled with my teenage daughter to El Salvador. We were on a service trip, staying in a rural community where a 10-year project to get running water is nearing completion. While we were there, we visited Radio Victoria, which is a grassroots community radio station that gives voice to the lives and the dreams of people of Santa Marta. And we visited the chapel where the Catholic Archbishop Oscar Romero was gunned down during a mass, assassinated by the Salvadoran military in 1980. If you've never been to El Salvador, let me tell you that all over the country are murals honoring Monsignor Romero. He is honored for speaking out for the poor and against oppression in his country, a cause for which he gave his life. So today I want to end my talk with a quote by Oscar Romero that I think speaks to our shared work in public media. And I use this quote because the dictionary's second definition of broadcasting, perhaps you know this, is to scatter seeds. Romero said, "We plant seeds that will one day grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing they will hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation realizing that. This enables us to do something and do it very well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning. Thank you.
Minutes for questions, and we have a mic here, so who wants to go first? Does anyone have a question?
I know you want to know more about the dress, right?
Tell us about the dress.
Well, this is actually an edition of our newspaper that came out in 2016 that was focused in on the diversity imperative in public media. And it was one that we had many, many extra copies printed, so we had more of them hanging around that could be turned into a wearable art project.
I have a question. You talked about the challenges of politics, covering politics at the moment in the US, which is quite extraordinary. In what ways have public media covered politics differently than their commercial counterparts? If they have done it differently, has it made any difference whatsoever?
Gosh, it's hard to know. I think whether or not it's making a difference, because usually the difference is measured by the results. Lots of public media in the US are coming up with innovative ways to cover elections. There was one station that focused in on people who had never voted before and told their stories. There was a station that followed a single voter in his process of making decisions. I think that the media in the US, including public media, were just overwhelmed by what's happening in Washington and in the country. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. Actions and language that's just not typical of what happens in our government. So I think that it's imperative that we're paying very close attention to not only just what is said out front, which is often about trying to distract us, while behind the scenes, all sorts of progress that's been made, not just during the Obama administration, but for the last 50 years, is being undone and unraveled. One of the most important stories that public media pays attention to is the disenfranchisement of voters in the United States, and how largely Republican politicians are trying to make it hard for people to exercise their basic fundamental right to cast a vote in an election. So we've got issues. We've got some serious issues. And I think that unfortunately what's happening in the US is that a lot of people are just tuning out because it's so very overwhelming.
You sound quite dispirited.
Well, I'm not depressed to be here. I find inspiration in what's happening in other places all the time. I kind of feel a little bit like the Local That Works project that we're doing is a really important source of information and inspiration, because it gets, it's very grassroots, and it gets down to the basic level of media and its relationship with its communities. So there's a lot happening there that doesn't bubble up to the NPR and the PBS and the national level. Good morning.
My name is Enrico Wilford. I'm chair of the National Communication Network in Ghana, and we are pushing a public broadcasting system in various parts of the country now rather than on the coast where the majority of the people live. With regard to PBS in the United States, and you said it, it is catered for the elite to an extent, and to the educated to another extent. How egalitarian has it become in this new dispensation with challenges probably from the Huffington Post and what have you? Are you getting a younger demographic to watch and listen to you?
There are little pockets of millennials tuning in to public TV. I mean, the fact is that most Americans are raised on public television. The children's programming, which does a much better job of reflecting the changing population of the United States, is available and used by people of all economic statuses. It's free. So the problem in public broadcasting is that we've got a lot of people on the very young side of the spectrum and a lot of people on the aging side of the spectrum, and then there's the middle years where there's not a lot of audience. But there are a lot of efforts underway to try to attract younger people, not just in the broadcast, but in the digital space. PBS has a whole digital studio where they produce a lot of shorter series. They're trying to create bingeable content that younger audiences will enjoy. They're distributing content on YouTube and other platforms. So there are a lot of smart people trying to figure it out. In terms of public media, particularly public television, catering to elites, 86% of people in the United States have tuned into public broadcasting in a one-year period. So there's a lot of people accessing it. Public radio, less so. Public radio stations have about 37 million listeners and a country of 360 million people. So it's an effort that's happening sort of community by community on the local level to try to bring people together and give voice to people whose stories and experiences are not always heard, either in mainstream media or in public broadcasting. It's a big focus of public media's efforts now. I don't know if it will work.
Other questions? Sorry.
Ooh, feedback. Yes. Hello.
Hello. Hello. I'm Tewi Lambi from Cameroon Radio Television. I'm interested in knowing the structure just of the public media in the U.S. How is it funded? I know you have a federal structure, each state funds, and how is the funding done? And then in terms of content, where do you lay emphasis? Is it on getting information? Are the audiences the king? Or since I know the American society is also highly commercial, how do they influence the output of public media?
Mm-hmm. So the way public media is funded is through an appropriation from Congress. That is the largest single pot of money. It's around $450 million a year. State governments invest about $200 million a year, and usually they're funding statewide networks, so about 20 states in the US have statewide networks as well. And then the rest of the money that adds up to that $3.5 billion comes from listeners who send in money during on-air fund drives, who have like a monthly sustainer donation taken out of their bank accounts or on their credit cards, and then businesses that spend on underwriting. And then we have a fair amount of money coming in from foundations. But really, it's largely supported by the people themselves making a decision to give, to sustain the service. So that is part of how we define ourselves as public. We are responsible to the people whose money is invested, or the people who choose to invest in the system. I'm not sure about the other half of your question. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So most of the stations pay attention to ratings and to what kinds of programs people are and are not listening to or watching, and decisions about the future of those programs is made based on how they're doing, largely. And a lot of public broadcasting programming has created avenues for people to participate. So there's an increasing amount of projects involving youth media so that youth voices can be brought in the mix. There are open avenues for getting user-generated content into programs. It's becoming more interactive so that audiences are not just passive recipients of the programming, but people who actually engage in it and help create it. Public broadcasting has really helped foster a very large infrastructure of artists and filmmakers and audio producers in the US. It's a really vibrant and vital sector.
We've run out of time, so thank you for those questions. I also want to thank Julie for a thoughtful speech. Thank you very much for your frankness and openness. You've stimulated some really good questions and some thinking, and a terrific way to start the day. So please join me in thanking Julie.
Thank you.
Dear colleagues, my name is Minna Horowitz. I'm former YLE researcher, now in the academia for a couple of decades, and I also do applied policy research. And I'm saying this so you would believe me when I say something. Already for maybe a decade from the sector of researchers, we have been able to realize that regardless of the region, regardless of the country, regardless of the institutional configuration or financial challenges and opportunities for public media, we share incredibly much. We share challenges, we share opportunities, we share dreams, and certainly we share values. And I'm sure that we all agree also that in this global media landscape, it's time for us to kind of declare those shared values, while, as it was so eloquently explained by a keynote and also in the breakfast, while local and national serving of our citizens is so important. And I also run a small group, 260 some researchers around the world. We're very informal. We're on social media called Global PSM Experts Network. Join us on Facebook. We use Facebook for something good. And see for yourself how actually research verifies what you know from your everyday work. And I'm so honored to be here because Public Media Alliance, to me, and to all of us, I know, is the pioneer of this kind of global local philosophy, bringing us together while honoring our individual organizations. And a case par excellence is really the following session of 15 minutes, where those who bring you the Public Media Alliance Weekly will showcase some challenges that we share and some exciting opportunities and inspiration from the newsletter that they've been producing. I believe you've been looking at it for a year now. Who reads the PMA newsletter, PMA Weekly? Homework. So join me in welcoming Christian Porter and Marta Catalano, who will take us through shared challenges and shared opportunities. Floor is yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. We were introduced earlier. I'm Christian Porter, the editorial manager of PMA, and this is Marta Catalano, the digital communications and content officer. We're here to talk to you about PSM Weekly, our weekly newsletter. And we're the ones who research, compile, and send it to you every week. And if you'd like to receive a copy, come and find us later. In short, PSM Weekly offers a global roundup of headlines about public media and also the key pillars of public media worldwide. So the fundamental pillars such as editorial independence, certain media freedoms, independent funding and transparency, any stories relating to those issues that might be of interest to those within the public media sphere. Now, you might be thinking, this is a bit much, to have a presentation about a newsletter. Well, it's much more than a newsletter. PSM Weekly gives us a unique perspective on the world of public media. On the one hand, it highlights the positives, the positive stories, the innovations that occur in the media, that occur within public media organizations. On the other, the all too depressing reality of the challenges that public media face worldwide. So, on the next slide, so from Brazil to Poland, Australia to Spain, we can all agree that media freedom is in decline worldwide. Our continuous research shows that the rapid growth in populism, the growth in political interference, media capture, both locally and increasingly internationally, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, are occurring in all corners. And this is having a profound effect on many of the world's public media organizations. The map on the board highlights some of the key threats that we've found in researching public media and PSM Weekly over the last year. In blue, the little blue dots on the map, it highlights areas of the world where media capture has been a huge issue, and we've found lots of stories relating to media capture in public media. The red highlights issues surrounding funding, so a bit like Julie just said in the US, but also in Australia and in Ireland. And then in the green highlights state interference. So this is where certain governments and states or actors for the state have interfered quite heavily with public media organizations. We haven't got long, so let's take a quick look at some of the crises that we found, some of the most prominent crises, and let's also then have a look at some of the innovative examples of solutions to these crises. So ABC Australia. As ABC News Director Gavin Morris recently said, there is no more fat to cut. Got to get that right. So we're talking about funding, and ABC is one of the best funded public service broadcasters in the world, yet its integrity as an independent and well-funded public broadcaster is really under threat. And this is thanks to political pressure from a string of governments who see the broadcaster as a threat, so they accuse it quite often of bias. And also a campaign against the ABC by commercial broadcasters who see it as having a competitive advantage through its federal funding. ABC is a trusted media organization. As you can see from the board, recent polls have shown that 70% of the public want a strong ABC, 80% trust the ABC, and 60% call for a funding increase of the ABC. Yet further cuts, despite this trust, have been announced. And this is all happening despite per capita funding of the ABC being 34% lower than most other broadcasters of a similar size, or public broadcasters of a similar size. Arguably, I'd say, these pressures are designed to undermine trust, and maybe, just maybe it will, if the ABC does not defend itself or promote its values effectively. We also have similar concerns to this, so a good example, as Julie pointed out earlier, was the US, and also Denmark, where it's recently been announced that a 20% cut will occur to DR's funding, and also its license fee will be replaced with a state levy tax. Another major concern for us is Spain, or has been Spain. Spain's public broadcaster, RTVE, has also experienced issues with funding and an unwillingness by its government to initiate reforms that would make it a truly independent public broadcaster. Often described as the tale of Europe's public broadcasters, workers and opposition parties have been fighting for greater independence from the state, which up until recently has been able to choose the broadcaster's managerial structure through a simple majority in Parliament. But thanks to strikes and campaigns, both by workers and by its audience, this has started to change, and the government has, since changing recently, been able to initiate some level of reform. But Spain, over the last year, the stories that we've been getting, it's seriously has been an example of a public broadcaster that experiences significant amounts of state interference. Other concerns for us include Austria, India, where recently there have been suggestions that the public broadcasters there be taken under full government control, and also Italy. Now, I've gone with a regional example here just because there's been so much news in PSM Weekly about Central Europe. And I'm trying to show here that the threats that public media faces is truly on a global scale. It's not in, a lot of people talk to me about it, you know, these sort of issues around media freedom happening in particular parts of the world or not happening in, say, parts of Europe or the US, but that's a complete fabrication or a misunderstanding. Across parts of Central Europe, a rise in populist and right-wing governments has resulted in moves against the public and independent media. And in Poland, this has been a key example in the fact that the state has taken over the managerial structure of the public broadcaster there. And also along with RTVS in Slovakia, there has been moves by governments to sack journalists on a mass scale. And this is predominantly because these journalists do not agree or are seen to agree or align themselves with the state. There's also the recent presidential election in the Czech Republic, which frankly was run by the now president with rhetoric that a certain other president would be proud of. And this included President Zeman standing at a rally with a Kalashnikov and brandished this Kalashnikov in front of his rally, and on the side was inscribed "for journalists" in Czech. And I think that's pretty harrowing, actually. But he's now firmly in place. So one other example I can quickly give is Hungary, where there's been a considerable amount of media capture by the state. So the states there, the President Orban, has made significant moves to influence the public broadcaster there, but also allies of Orban have taken over huge swathes of commercial media there, or at least in a managerial level. Other examples we've seen in recent years, Brazil, where EBC, after recent presidential changes about 2 years ago, was taken under control of the government, but also in certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa and in Tonga. Here's a quick picture, if you didn't believe me, about the Kalashnikov, which, yeah, I don't really know what else to say. But where there's doom and gloom, there are always positives. And I think that just comes inherently with what public media is and what public broadcasting is. Public media does garner a considerable amount of trust worldwide. As Julie said, in the US, public media is one of the most trusted sources of news there. Even in South Africa, the SABC garners 50.7% trust from the public. And in Finland, YLE, public broadcaster, is the most trusted source of news. Countless research shows that democracy is a key pillar of public media. Public media offers something substantial to democracy in that it informs impartially and helps to create an informed electorate. And then there's the values. People understand what public media is when they're told about it, when it's sold, when it's taught to them, when they hear about it. I mean, there's a recent referendum in Switzerland, which was all about whether or not the public broadcaster should maintain public funding. And there's a fantastic campaign by the public broadcaster there to educate the electorate on exactly what they would be missing out on if the public broadcaster there was not funded effectively. And thankfully, they won. But still, where there are issues, And where these positives exist, they need to be reinforced. And we believe we've found some solutions in our research from PSM Weekly.
Yes, because actually where there are global issues, there are also global solutions. And looking at PSM Weekly, we were able to identify 4 main trends. And I think it's also important to look outside of public media to see what organizations as well as individuals are doing to innovate and experiment. The first one surely is collaboration and the importance of involving the audience, as well as continuing to experiment, whether it is at a big or a local scale, it doesn't matter, it needs to be continuous. And also it's important to think beyond broadcasting. What can we do offline? What can we do off our screens as well? So I think we can all agree that there is strength in numbers. And the first example is Norway's Faktisk, which is a truly collaborative project between print, commercial, and public broadcaster. Normally, these would be competitors in a media landscape, but they were able to identify shared values, to work together to bring truthful information to the public during debates and on social media. But collaboration also can happen within a newsroom itself and in an organic way. If we look at the newspaper, the French newspaper Le Monde, they created a Snapchat team where video journalists, data designers, and motion designers actually came together to bring data and information to their audience on Snapchat. And the key actually here is the audience. I mean, after all, what is public broadcasting without the public? The first example is Vox Borders, which is a series on YouTube that explains geographical and political borders across the globe. And before starting, the editor and the journalist asked people on the internet to guide them and to see where they were going to report in that series. And 6,000 people replied, and they became co-creators of this web series, which is actually one of the most successful on YouTube from Vox, obviously. But public broadcasters can innovate as well. And the public broadcaster in Finland created a content hub where young people aged 15 to 25 create content to discover and underpin the various different range of Finnish culture. And it's also important for public broadcasters to embrace different formats. If we take, for example, graphic journalism, artists from Latin America, as well as public broadcasters in Canada, the CBC, and Australia, the SBS, use graphic journalism and comics to talk about various society's issues, such as freedom of expression, migration. And we all know that podcasts are a great way to revitalize radio, but also our smartphones can be great tools. And Radio New Zealand experimented with Vox Pop, which is an app that allows people to record their speech, which will later be transcribed into text and sent to the broadcaster for potential to be broadcast or used on their reports, which is also a great way to involve the audience. And if we think about going beyond broadcasting, it's important to engage the audiences of our screens as well, as I said before. In Czech Republic, the public broadcasters actually goes into schools and organizes workshops for teachers and media workers and NGOs to, underpin and kind of navigate the media terrain, which can be, quite frankly, a bit, scary sometimes. And in the UK, the BBC organized a BBC school report where 11 to 18 years old actually can pitch to BBC editors and, learn the whole editing process as well. So now actually it's your turn, because we thought about picking your brains a little bit and asking you a few questions that you can think about throughout the day as the discussion goes.
So number one that we came up with was, what is the one change you would implement in your newsroom today? And in what ways can public media be of better public value? And a third question we'd like you to think about today is, how can your organization better communicate with and include your audience? So with that, thank you. I know it's brief and been a bit of a sort of rapid run through, but thank you so much. And please subscribe to PSM Weekly. Also get involved. Send us your stories. Send us any information you have about public media where you are. It is hard for us in the sort of little corner of England where we are to know everything. So thank you.
So thank you very much again to my colleagues. They work incredibly hard. They say they don't know too much. I've spent probably 30 odd years in public media. And when I hear them talking, we all share an office. When I hear them talking about the stories, about what's happening now, I realize that they're probably two of the most knowledgeable young people in public media anywhere in the world, in the arguments and the issues. PSN Weekly is free. You just sign up to it, either seeing us here or via our website. We're now going to take a tea break in the room next door, back in 15 minutes. What we've talked about is what's happening worldwide. The next session, we come right back, right here to the heart of the Caribbean with what public media does best. A very human story that we've been working on with The Guardian in the UK about what's happening around the Windrush generation. And I think what you'll find, and we want to involve all of you in that conversation, is we're almost sort of doing journalism on the hoof for the next session after the tea break. So enjoy your tea, enjoy getting to know one another, and see you all back here very soon. Thank you.
Carry the 16 over my back, 45 in my